cancel the parade in your favor? Yeah, no, that sounds very French to me. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Family, which is episode 2 of season 4 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my Patreon user polls, and the episode to win my latest Patreon poll is the TNG episode Family, or rather it was a three-way tie between the Voyager episode Lineage and the original series episode Journey to Babel, but I had to choose, and I was actually stuck between three. Like, I was going back and forth on which episode I would actually choose, and then finally I just wanted to say cancel the parade in your favor, so I chose Family. Anyway, so Family is the second episode of the fourth season that takes place directly after the events of Best of Both Worlds, where the Enterprise is at Earth being repaired, and so the crew can have shore leave at Earth or to visit their family. Picard decides to visit his brother, who is married with a kid named Renee, so he decided to visit their family while he's on vacation, but of course the brother is a bit of a bully to him. Meanwhile, Worf's parents, his adoptive human parents that is, beam up and visit him on the Enterprise, and Wesley finds that he has a message from his father that his father recorded when he was first born that he had never seen before. So, when this episode first came out, or actually, not first came out, when I first saw it, actually, as I mentioned in many other videos before I started watching TNG during the 5th season, for some reason, this was before the days of, internet, even DVD collections, and so the only way for me to watch it is through syndication on TV. I had to tune in at the right time, and I was subject to whatever they felt like showing, and they felt like showing season 4 over and over and over again. But the funny thing is, they didn't feel like showing Best of Both Worlds, because I think they considered that season 3, so it actually took a while before I could see Best of Both Worlds, so I saw this episode out of context. So I never cared for it, and even when I did get the context, I didn't like this episode. I thought it was really boring. Now, granted, remind you, I was 12 years old, and and my opinion of this episode has, of course, changed when I grew up. I actually hated Inner Light, too, when I was 12 years old. Now it's my bar none number one favorite episode of TNG, so it goes to show how opinions change. However, even though my opinion has evolved on this episode a lot, and I actually like it, I still think it's kind of boring, if I'm being honest. I do think this is a good episode. I'll, spoil my rating by telling you that right up front, but I think it's a little bit overrated. As some people put this in their top 10s, top 20s, and rant and rave about this is an amazing episode. Don't get me wrong. As I said, my opinion has evolved on this. I actually think it is a really good character story, and I very much appreciate, I can't understate how much I appreciate that they actually followed up the events of Best of Both Worlds. Of course, in modern day television, that's normal. Like, every show does it. Why would you not do that? But in this episodic era of storytelling, that was not normal to do it. And goddamn, I appreciate it so much. But there's still some things I don't like about this episode, and I think it is a tad bit boring. Now, I hate calling an episode that doesn't have a thread of the week boring, because that's why they never do, really good character episodes. They always have to have a stupid side plot of, here's a threat to the ship, just to keep it interesting, or throw in a threat of the week that doesn't actually need to be there. Fistful of Datas is a prime example of this, because that was actually a decent episode of Worf bonding with his son, spending time in the holodeck, but then they just threw in this ridiculous threat of Data taking over and wanting to kill everyone, which actually detracted from the main story of Worf spending time with his son, so that actually ruined the episode. That's only one of dozens of examples I could give for them trying to do Voyager. There's like practically every episode in the later seasons. They almost ruined it by having to throw in the thread of the week. So I don't like when they actually do an episode that doesn't have a thread of the week. I don't like saying, well, it didn't work because it was kind of boring, because that makes it sound like I need to have the thread, but I don't. I talked about in early seasons of Voyager and other episodes. There's episodes I love specifically because they avoided the thread of the week and they didn't have it, and I wish they avoided the thread of the week more. But honestly, in this episode, I don't think necessarily it should have had the thread of the week. But I still find it a little bit boring. It's some of it's good character stories, but some of it, I don't know, some of it doesn't work for me as well. Now, Rick Berman originally did want to have this be a third of a week, so when Michael Piller had the idea for this episode to do a follow-up to Best of Both Worlds, you can imagine, if you know anything about the studio or Rick Berman at the time, you could imagine his response. And his response was, of course, no! This is serialized! This is not serialized storytelling. We're episodic. Each episode has to stand alone. You have to be any oddball who tunes in any odd time of the week and just pick it up and let it go. But here's the thing, like, Next Generation at this point in time was already not that. There was an ongoing, and it's referenced in this episode, which I didn't get when I first saw it. There was several ongoing storylines, and one in this episode was referenced one with Worf being disaccommodated, which if you haven't seen Sins of the Father, you don't know what the hell they're talking about. There's also plenty of other, like the Borg, like in Best of Both Worlds, they don't take time to explain it. Like, they assume you know because they assume you've seen Q. So there's already an element, and I always fight against people who say, oh, TNG was so episodic. I always fight back because I think the studio and the producers, Rick Berman, tried to make it so episodic, but the writers managed to slip in continuity here and there whenever they could. Whereas something like the original series, even though it did have some reoccurring aliens like Klingons, Romulans, whatever, and they had like built the lore with the Vulcans, that actually was an extremely episodic show, but that was back in the 60s. Next Generation, I don't fight against people who say it's extremely episodic. But, and this is like the biggest example, though, of them not being episodic. So I do very much appreciate it for that. And because they could slip in the stuff with Worf's discommodation and ongoing storylines with Q or Barclay or whatever, where they reference previous episodes. They could slip those in. But this was very in your face, very obvious string continuity. It was very obvious serialization, and so of course Rick Berman said no, but Michael Piller really, really wanted this, and he kept pushing for it, and he kept eating at it, and it's like he pitched it in his way. Look, Michael Piller thought it would take away from the show's credibility if all of a sudden Picard is fine the next day after this really, really, really horrifying event, and that we needed to see the repercussions for that. So eventually Berman caved, but his condition was that they have a subplot with a sci-fi thread of the week element, where he didn't use those words, but that's essentially what it was. Now, this format is something that the Star Trek has done a lot, particularly the next season of TNG, season 5, they did this so much, where they have two plots, A plot and B plot. The A plot's a character story, and the B plot's some nonsense sci-fi bullshit like an anomaly that nobody gives a shit, and it's just there to, ooh, look at this. And I don't like those kind of format, those episodes. I really don't, which is why I'm not that huge on season 5 as some people are. And also Voyager, don't even get me started on Voyager. They do that format so much. It's crazy, and I hate it. So I'm actually glad that they didn't do that. I think if they had Picard on Earth, hanging out with his brother and having this feuds and this emotional scenes over how helpless he felt during the Borg, if the B story intercutting between that with some bullshit sci-fi shit going on in the Enterprise in orbit, that would have damaged the episode. It would not have been as good, and it would have, they just wouldn't have gelled. I think what they actually did by making it a theme of family, which of course is what they called the episode, not a very original title, but it accurately explains what this episode is about. That was actually brilliant. Because that actually works a lot better, where the stories that intercut between the Picard storyline also deal with the same thing. I actually think that works a lot better. So when I say I find this episode a tad bit boring, it has nothing to do with them not having a threaded week. I'm glad they didn't. I think it clearly would have made the episode worse. What I mean by that, particularly the Picard storyline, I guess this speaks more to my personal taste, because there's a certain type of like these older, like, well, not older, but British movies set in older times, like classical times. It doesn't even have to be like Victorian times or medieval times. You could even be like the 1940s, even as recent as the 1980s. But they had this feel, it's like, ooh, look at this back in this time, and you know, it's hard for me to describe, but it's a very sort of, it has this British slow-paced feel to it that I find incredibly boring. The biggest example I could give for this is like a Jane Austen novels or any of the billions of adaptations they've done to it. I loathe Jane Austen. I find this story is the most boring thing ever. But that's set further in the past. As I said, it doesn't have to be that far. There was a lot of certain movies that I can't remember because they were so forgettable, because I found them so goddamn boring, that were set like in the 40s and 80s. And I know this is set in present times, but it has that feel to it. And it's supposed to be France, but Consul de Parade, they're not French. They're the most, of course, Picard was always the most British Frenchman you've ever known. Of course, his family would be the same thing. So, but it has that same, that boring feel to it. Now, not as bad, to be honest, not as bad, but it's, I feel like, alright, so let me get into Picard stuff, because I'm probably, why you hate the storyline? You're so dumb, you're so wrong, Mark, you hate it. I don't hate it. I like it. But, as I say, I think it could have been better, and I do find parts of it a bit boring. I find it a bit tedious, the way that Robert is just a dick to Jean-Luc the whole entire time till the end. And they had this, you know, the fight, and they're like, Consul de Parade in your favor, and they end up like throwing mud at each other, and then they start laughing for no reason, and then Picard has the emotional let out, and then all of a sudden they're friends again. Like, I kind of didn't buy that progression. This is like, all just because they start fighting, now they're the best friends, and Robert's like, I love you, Jean-Luc. Well, he does, to be fair, he does say, I still hate you, but he gives him like a big hug, and like, you know, you're always welcome here, and all that shit right before he leaves. So he's all of a sudden nice to him. Because when he does say, I still hate you, he's saying it like in a jokey way, like they laugh about it. But anyway, I don't think he says hate you anyway. I think he says I still don't like you, but whatever. So I don't know. There's something about Robert and the way that whole thing, the way he reacts. It's just, I didn't buy, and I found it kind of boring. Now, when I say I really like the storyline, I'm more talking about Jean-Luc's inner storyline, his inner character story, like the what he goes to where he's feeling lost, like the conversation he has with Troy at the start of the episode, where he's, you know, she's being really worried, why are you going to visit your family? And he's like, I'm just doing it, and she kept like seeing more into it, and that was kind of annoying him. But it's obvious that he was in a lot of pain. He was hiding it, and Troy, of course, can sense emotions, so she knows this, but she doesn't want to be blunt about it because she's a professional, or supposedly. But anyway, in this case, she's doing a good job. That was a cool scene, and so that kind of sets the stage for when Picard goes to see his family. You're not really sure what he wants, and you know, his brother's being a dick to him, and his old friend is trying to trick him into, you know, doing this ocean project, this Atlantis project where they raise the ocean floor. I wanted to know more about that, but the episode kept, like, every time they were about to get to more detail, they would interrupt and make it about Jean-Luc being promoted to this thing or leaving the Enterprise. I'm like, I want to hear more about this fight. Why would they raise the ocean floor? Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, I guess it was just some BS they could come up with as something he could do on Earth. But I actually wanted to hear about it. It sounded interesting to me. But anyway, so I love when Jean-Luc lets out about, he opens up to Robert about the Borg and his experience and how he felt helpless, and Robert is like, so you're human after all. That was a great moment. I love that. It really hit the feels. As I said, I can't emphasize this enough. I love that they reference Best of Both Worlds. It's so great that they show the repercussions of it. However, I would argue it's just that one scene that they do. Now, granted, it is throughout the entire episode that's the theme in the background, like Troy talking to Picard at the start, and it's always in the back of your mind that this Picard's like recovering from this incident, but they only address it head on in that one scene. And so I think some people again, I was just glowing about how rare this is in episodic TNG, but I think some people overstate how much this episode reflects on Best of Both Worlds. Prime example, I've heard some people refer to this as part 3 of Best of Both Worlds. That really they form a 3-parter. That's absolutely not true. I'm like, objectively, that is just not true. Now, there's some cases with Enterprise and Deep Space Nine that had the serialized storytelling run in, where sometimes it's a 3-parter, sometimes it's a 2-parter. You know, for Enterprise, it's like the 3 episodes that end season 3. Most people call that a 2-parter with Countdown 0 Hour, but I actually call it 3-parter with the Council Countdown and 0 Hour. So, and there's also Deep Space Nine examples of this. Are they actually 2-parters or just different episodes? So a lot of that is objective. A lot of that you could be like, well, you know, maybe that's a 3-parter here, that's a 2-parter there. That's just my opinion that those 3 episodes form a 3-parter. And then the Enterprise example I gave you, other people could say it's a 2-parter. Other people say, well, each episode is just their own, like, part of their own serialized thing, like an episode of Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad. And I think all of those opinions are valid. Saying that this is a 3-parter Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2 and this is not valid. I'm sorry, it's not. At best, this is an epilogue. At best. Now, it's if this was a normal modern-day serialized show, I would say flat out this is an independent episode that just referenced the events before. In modern times, that's very common. And in this era, not so common as everyone wants to make a huge deal out of it. And it is a huge deal. I also made a huge deal, but not that huge of a deal. It's definitely not part 3. Definitely not. That's ridiculous. Yeah. So I love but I still love that moment when Jean-Luc breaks down, because it's a really one of the rare, like, human moments of Picard. And it's also interesting seeing Picard's interactions with his brother, his sister-in-law, and his nephew, and his old best friend, because that's a different side of Picard that we don't see that much. He's not the Starfleet captain who has to rule over people and negotiate and do all this other stuff. He's just a guy visiting his relatives and seeing his old friends, and that's a different side of him, and I also love it for that. But the whole Robert being a dick and cancel the parade and being an asshole to them, that I could have done with that. I can think they could have downplayed that. I mean, they could have had some tension between them, sure, because you have to have some sort of arc, but he seemed to be a dick for no reason. He seemed to be irrational, dickish, and all of a sudden, oh, I love you. I didn't quite buy it. But I do, as I say, still love that emotional outburst. And also they had this whole thing, and Robert, during their conversations, kept trying to frame it like, oh, so now you got to decide. Do you want to go up back to the Enterprise, or do you want to go down to the oceans with your old friend? that is false stakes. There's no fucking way. Like, even if you take the knowledge, that this is a show, and of course Jean-Luc Picard is going to go back to the Enterprise because the show needs to keep going. Even if you take that knowledge out in the episode itself, Jean-Luc makes it clear that he's not really interested in doing this Atlantis project. It fascinates him, but there's no way he would quit Starfleet for that, and they made that very clear. So them trying to say, "Oh, it was fake stakes for me. What do you do? Do you do this or do you?" Obviously, he's gonna do that. It's not even a fucking choice. So why even frame it like that? That was stupid. that kind of annoyed me. But yeah, but overall, I do like this storyline. I just don't think it's the bee's knees like many other people tend to. Then there's a storyline with Worf and his parents, and I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. I kind of like this storyline better. Now, it's not as powerful, like, definitely not as powerful as that moment where Picard is confessing, "I should have been strong enough." Like, that was obviously the high point of the episode. There was nothing stronger than that. There was nothing in the Worf storyline that was stronger than that. But the Worf storyline is more consistent, whereas I don't have all the issues with it that I had with the Picard storyline. It flows better. It makes more sense. It's simpler. And I also really like seeing more of Worf's human family, because I feel like the show doesn't talk about this enough. It always talks about his, it had the whole story arc, several episodes long, about his Klingon family and his heritage, and Kern and all his Klingon. And it just, oh, by the way, he was raised by humans. And they never touch on that. And so this is one of the rare episodes when they do. The other one I really like is when we meet Worf's foster brother, who they did mention in the previous episode, and so I was waiting for him to be introduced, and I thought that was amazing as well, but that's an episode for another time. So I love that we get to see his parents, that they're Russian, and they're like all quirky. And there is a storyline here too, because Worf is a very sort of, "I'm a Klingon, I shouldn't be bothered by my plans," and plus he wants to be alone in this shame of discommodation, and doesn't want it to, it's something that's very personal. He doesn't really want to share it, so he's very standoffish to his parents. But the more time he spends with them, the more he realizes that they just care about him and that he loves them. So eventually he does open up to them about it, and they don't really discuss in great detail, but they say that we are here for you, Worf. We know you're a great man. Whatever happened, we support you, and he really appreciates that. So that was a nice flow that actually really worked for me. And plus, as I said, I enjoyed seeing these characters and their interactions with Worf, and I like that scene when Picard comes on board and Worf is like very proudly, "These are my parents." Like, he's so proud, he's got a smile on his face, and Picard is so happy to meet them, and they're just being silly. "I got all the specs and diagrams at home." Like, that was a great scene. So I thought the storyline was actually more solid. Not as powerful as the Picard breakdown, obviously, but more solid. And then there's the other. I don't even want to call this storyline. It's actually more like a moment with Wesley Crusher. So Beverly Crusher discovers that there's this box or whatever of her husband's stuff, and he had this message that he recorded for Wesley the day he was born, and she to give to him on his 18th birthday, and he's turning 18, so she decides to give it to him, and he watches it. So this isn't a storyline, it's just a moment. And what this is, and I know people are gonna yell at me and they're gonna be triggered as soon as I say this word, but I'm sorry, I don't really necessarily mean this in a negative connotation, but maybe slightly, but this is what it is. It's filler. It is. I know. "Oh, did you say it's filler? It's so important to Wesley." No, hear me out. So, as I said, originally they were gonna do a bullshit sci-fi storyline with some aliens sneaking on the Enterprise while Picard was down visiting Robert, and they very correctly 86 that idea. And so then they came up with the Worf thing with his parents, but then they found that still wasn't enough to fill up the other episode, the entire episode. So they needed something else to fill that time, and they came up with this. Now, why is this filler as opposed to the Worf stuff or Picard? Well, Picard was obviously the A plot, but why is this filler as opposed to Worf? Because it doesn't have, there's no growth, there's no character arc, there's no story, there's no narrative in this. In the way like the Picard storyline, there is a narrative. There's a story. Picard is feeling, trying to hide from his pain. He goes to visit his brother. His brother brings up that pain, and he has to face it head on. And so he goes from like being lost, not knowing what to do, to actually realizing his place in the world and strengthening his relationship with his family. And now they're closer. So that's a narrative. That's a journey that Picard went through in this episode. And Worf, even though it's a smaller thing, again, I just explained, it's also a journey because at first he's standoffish to his parents. He doesn't want to invite them in. He doesn't want to let them know about this, but then he spends time with them. He appreciates them. He learns to open up, and he feels better. So that's a journey that Worf went through. This storyline, Beverly has found the message from Wesley's father, gives it to him, he watches it. Now you can say, oh, but Wesley gets to see his father, and it's such a powerful moment for him. It is, and I won't deny that. But there's no narrative in there. There's no character growth. There's nothing that changed. It's just he watches the message. It's very powerful. He misses his dad. That's it. No story. It's filler. They didn't have enough time to fill up this episode. Now, does that mean I hate one? No, I don't hate it. Because, as I said, this is why I'm saying it's not necessarily negative connotations, because it doesn't bother me like the filler in The Walking Dead, for example, bothers me because it's so boring and a waste of time. Just get to the main story. But anyway, it doesn't have that feeling in this episode. It's because it contributes to the theme of the family, and it is a powerful moment for Wesley. It's not a storyline, but it's a moment, and it's a powerful moment for Wesley to actually see his father. So it is definitely filler, but I don't mind it. It's good filler. It's okay filler. I can live with it. It helps the episode along. They didn't have enough time to fill up the episode, so sure, do this. It does add to Wesley's character a bit. But he's going to leave the show soon anyway, so who cares? So, my rating for Family out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. For as much as the complaints I had, as I said, that whole Picard breaking down and realizing, and the journey that he went through and realizing he wasn't strong enough, and him opening up and just seeing that other side of Picard was great. I loved it. And as I said, I love seeing Worf's parents. I love that storyline. The whole thing was solid, and even the filler was decent with Wesley. So, a solid episode, an 8. When I say it was overrated, some people would give it a 9 or 10. 9, maybe. I'm not going to quarrel with too much. 10, just calm down. As I said, it's a little boring at parts. But definitely a solid 8. Extremely good. So that's it for my review of Family. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you for all the Patreon supporters who voted in polls, who support me on Patreon. It keeps me going. I very much appreciate it. If you would like to also contribute to my Patreon, and you can vote in the polls, and you can, if you contribute a certain amount of money, you can request videos, you get early access to videos and whatnot, such as videos like these. Patreon supporters get them 2 months in advance. You can click the link below in the description, and it will take you to my Patreon page where you can support me for as little as $1 a month. Anything is supportive. I just appreciate the support so much. And I appreciate, of course, everyone who even isn't a Patreon supporter who's supporting the channel by watching, leaving a like, subscribing. Also very important, so thank you guys so much. And be sure to check out my channel for all sorts of other Star Trek stuff and shows like The Expanse and Star Wars: The Clone Wars and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.